with McMurchie.
Thank you. The pointer. All right, thank you. All right, well, hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about a difference in strategy, how habitat affects functional traits related to pyrogenicity and colonization in Bolivian Guadua. I'm Elizabeth McMurchie. My collaborators are Joe Veldman, Maira Martinez, and Lynn Clark. So to begin my talk, I'm just going to introduce a few of the major concepts I'm going to be talking about today and our study location. I'm also then going to be moving on to talk about our hypotheses and then the methods of this particular study, and then move on to talk about our next steps and our preliminary results. So where we conducted this study was in Chiquitanía, Bolivia, and this is located between these two red lines on the map here. This is the department of Santa Cruz, Bolivia. It's the eastern region of Bolivia. The main forest type there is the Bosque Seco Chiquitano, which is a tropical dry forest. However, it's not just tropical dry forest there, it's actually a mosaic of the tropical dry forest, Bosque Seco Chiquitano, and cerrado and savanna habitats. Many of these savanna habitats appear to actually be old-growth savanna, so they appear to have existed in particular locations for potentially hundreds or even thousands of years, and this is based on the soil types that we see there and the evidence of past fires. However, these forest and savanna mosaics appear to exist in alternate stable states, so they can persist for a very long time, and then something will change that will cause them to flip very rapidly from savanna to forest or forest to savanna. This region, however, right now is experiencing a lot of change due to anthropogenic reasons. So a lot of the Bosque Seco Chiquitano is being exploited for lumber, and both the Bosque Seco Chiquitano and the savanna habitats are being converted very rapidly to agriculture, primarily actually to a cattle pasture. There's also a concern that with the recent increase in fires in this region, both anthropogenic and possibly anthropogenic, started by lightning strikes, that savanna species, which experience frequent fire and potentially even are spreading fire, might spread fire into the Bosque Seco Chiquitano and be destroying this very unique and interesting habitat and converting it into potentially degraded savanna instead. So that's a concern that is currently going on in Bolivia. So this is what you see when you're looking at Chiquitanía a lot of the time. So you'll have this savanna out here out front. This is a little bit degraded, so we have our cattle here that are eating this savanna, but it likely has existed in this particular area for hundreds of years. And behind that, we have tropical dry forest. And the distinction between these two habitats is quite sharp. And this tropical dry forest here, it does appear to be old growth in this particular picture. All right, so functional traits, what are those? So they are traits that can affect the fitness of a species through their indirect effect, or indirectly through their effects on survival or reproduction and growth. And depending on the habitat and other pressures that these species face, we can see different combinations of functional traits in a particular area. So for example, grasses that are in areas where there's high herbivory, with our lovely horse here as an example of a herbivore, are often quite short in stature and form these sort of grazing lawns where they have stoloniferous growth above the surface of the soil. Makes it more difficult for them to pull up the entire plant. Whereas in areas such as the Cerrado here, where they experience frequent fire and there are not that many herbivores present on the landscape in that particular region, these grasses are taller, a little bit more spread out from each other, and they experience rhizomatous growth underground instead of the above ground stoloniferous tillering. Most bamboos aren't able to survive that kind of high fire environment. However, Guadua paniculata, which is a wide-ranging neotropical savanna bamboo, is. And it's actually also known to be able to invade areas of recent human disturbance. So when people cut down the Bosque Seco Chiquitano and other areas, so this actually ranges all the way from Mexico down to Bolivia and southern Brazil, this guado can potentially invade these areas, primarily in regions where it's very common, such as eastern Bolivia. It's also been seen in Bolivia that if you have a Guado paniculata savanna, if a fire comes through there, trees that are growing in that savanna are much more likely to be killed than trees that experience the same levels of fire in the tropical dry forest instead. So they're sort of eliminating trees from these savannas when these fires come through. And this is what it looks like. So we can see it's not devoid of trees. There are a few fire-tolerant trees in the Guado paniculata savanna there. It's otherwise fairly open. So what we were curious to see was how the functional traits of Guado paniculata related to specifically colonization, competition for light, and tolerance and promotion of fire differ in Guado paniculata from their congeners. I wasn't moving forward there, excuse me. But what is guado itself? So what are these congeners going to be like? Well, guadua are the lowland thorny bamboos. They pretty much exist only in lowland habitats, and they are almost entirely, with a few exceptions, very thorny. There's currently 34 described species, with more left to be described. They range from central Mexico all the way down to southern Brazil and Argentina. They are usually fairly large in size, so they can be as small as 3 meters tall, but they are typically larger than that. And some of them can get to be up to 30 meters in height. So these are among some of the tallest bamboos in the world, and they're quite robust as well. So Guadua chacoensis is a good example of that, very tree-like in habit. And they typically bear bands of hair, often bright in color, above and below their nodes. And you can see it here on the Guadua chacoensis. And they have these unusual branch flowering structures known as pseudospikelets, which are present only in a few genera of bamboos. They are very ecologically important. So they can form these really big stands. Here's a stand, oops, go back. Here's a stand in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. This scale down here is about 1 kilometer. This is over a square kilometer in size. This is almost entirely Guado paniculata, making up this light green here on our map. And they can get much bigger than that, especially in the Amazon, these stands of Guado bamboo. They also can, some species have been seen to form, to perpetuate these cycles of disturbance. So in particular, Guado Weber baueri and Guado sarcocarpa have been seen to, they have these hooks, these branched sort of hook-like thorns on their branches and on their culms. They use them to hook on over trees. They can weigh them down, break them, and actually kill them and sort of perpetuate the cycle of disturbance and exploit those gaps that they form in the forest there by killing these trees. Some species compete a little bit more directly with trees, however, so Guado chacoensis is a good example of that. It has a very tree-like habit. They're not climbing up over trees, they're just acting like trees. So again, we're looking to see whether how the functional traits of Guado paniculata related to colonization, growth, and pyrogenicity differ from those of its congeners. And we're also curious to see just, is Guado paniculata pyrogenic? So is it promoting the spread of fire? Our hypotheses were that if it is truly pyrogenic compared to other species of Guadua, and if it's not really focusing on colonization, it would have these shorter, narrower, and thinner walled culms and less above ground biomass. So it's not going to be focusing on creating above ground growth that's just going to get killed by fire. It's also not working to compete directly against trees. It doesn't mean it need to get really tall and climb up over them. It's just going to be killing them with fire instead. We also expect it to have smaller deciduous foliage leaves. So again, they don't need to be big. They don't need to shade out anything else or compete for light that way. We also expect to see a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. So we're not going to be wasting that nitrogen when these fires come through. We also expect them to have shorter but fairly wide rhizomes with a lot of dormant rhizome buds. So when the fire comes through, they're going to be able to shoot back up from those dormant buds that were protected underground. However, we do expect them to have fewer rhizomes, so they're not going to put as much energy into colonization when they really need to focus on persisting. All right, so here's what these species that we've focused on so far have looked like. So these are the three that we've been able to access in Bolivia at this point. This is Guadua paniculata on the left. We've seen several pictures of that so far. Guadua weber-baueri, which is this leaning and climbing tree-killing species. And then the tree-like Guadua chacoensis on the far right. So for each species, we made a voucher collection first, and then we selected individual culms for sampling and measured culm height, diameter at base, and breast height. We then cut our culms to measure internode wall thickness at the internode that contained the breast height, and then we laid them out to measure culm height. And in some cases, they were quite long. We then measured above ground biomass in different categories, so fine biomass, fine fuel, intermediate, and then coarse biomass, and we took subsamples for drawings for our calculations. And then we collected green and senesced foliage leaves for our foliage leaf measurements. And then we dug up our rhizomes, which was a big effort. So we exposed the parent rhizome. This is the one leading to the culm of interest, and we measured rhizome length, distance, vertical and horizontal width, and the number of dormant buds, as well as culm resprouts. So culm resprouts, this is if the culm died back and it essentially resprouted from a bud on the culm. So you often cannot tell in these species until you dig them up that this happened. All right, so to visualize our data, we created PCAs and histograms. And this is what our initial PCA looks like for just these three species. So we have Guadua chacoensis clustered on the left here, Guadua paniculata and weber-baueri, a lot of overlap, except for these two Guadua culms of weber-baueri there. So what's going on? It's size-related metrics that are really driving the difference in Guadua chacoensis from the others, as well as their production of rhizomes. So they make a lot of rhizomes. We only saw resprouts of the original culm in Guadua paniculata. We also saw a lot of dormant rhizome buds in both paniculata and weber-baueri. And these 2 points here is Guadua weber-baueri. Those two culms had really long rhizomes, whereas there was a lot of variability there. With the others, so they were a lot shorter. Okay, so we also, between these three species, we did some ANOVAs of the rhizome, culm, biomass, and bud characters, and then did some pairwise post-hoc comparisons there. So moving on to our histograms and our results of our ANOVAs, we didn't see any significance in rhizome length so far, and this is a little bit surprising. If you look at the histogram, Guadua weber-baueri, this tree-killing forest species, can have really long rhizomes, but it can also have really short ones. So this is one where we need to do a lot more measurement in the field, potentially. We did find, however, Guadua chacoensis has significantly wider rhizomes than the other two species. This is our tree-like species. It has these big rhizomes to anchor it to the soil, and this was really sort of intuitive. We didn't see any significant difference, however, between Guadua weber-baueri and paniculata. Guadua weber-baueri had significantly more dormant rhizome buds than Guadua chacoensis did, but there was no significant difference between paniculata and the other two. So Guadua weber-baueri has the most dormant rhizome buds, which is a little bit surprising there. Of course, there's an outlier in paniculata there as well. But Guadua chacoensis, basically all those dormant rhizomes, buds, they're not dormant anymore. They're being converted to rhizomes that actually seem to be helping anchor it to the soil. All of our species differ significantly from each other in terms of rhizomes produced. Guadua chacoensis makes a ton of rhizomes, and it has a ton of shoots coming up around it typically as well. Guadua weber-baueri is intermediate, makes more rhizomes than Guadua paniculata does, and then in line with our hypotheses, Guadua paniculata actually produces the fewest number of rhizomes. All of our species differ significantly from each other in terms of diameter at base as well. Again, chacoensis, our big one, it is big. Weber-baueri is bigger in terms of diameter at base than paniculata, and paniculata is quite small at its base. They also differed significantly from each other in terms of height. So similar results for diameter at base in height here. Guadua chacoensis, very big like a tree. Guadua weber-baueri climbing up really tall into those trees that it tries to climb over and break. And then Guadua paniculata is small and arching instead, so it doesn't get that high above the ground. However, culm length, we don't see any significant difference between Guadua paniculata and weber-baueri here. And why is that? So culm height, we're measuring just the highest point that the culm reaches. We're not measuring the entire length of the culm. So Guadua paniculata is small and arching. So it doesn't get that high, but it's actually fairly long, even if it's arching over and touching the ground. Whereas Weber-Bowerii is climbing up really tall into those trees and is more, and it typically is taller than the vast majority of the paniculata that we see, longer than the, Guadua chacoensis, again, all the way out by itself, being absolutely huge. Internode wall thickness, again, we saw Guadua chacoensis having these really thick internode walls, but no significant difference between the internode walls of Weber-Bowerii and paniculata, although we see paniculata can have wider walls than we saw in any of our Weber-Bowerii that we measured. We were curious about this, though, because Guadua paniculata can actually have solid culms. So when we compare the size of the culms to their internode, to the diameter at breast height, so again, we were measuring internode wall thickness at the internode that contained breast height. We found that Guadua paniculata has these really chunky internodes walls compared to their diameter there. So internode wall thickness was significantly greater for Guadua paniculata than it was from Guadua chacoensis or Weber-Bowerii. A little bit surprisingly here, we didn't see any significant difference between Weber-Bowerii and chacoensis, although Weber-Bowerii can have really thin culm walls. In fact, they're so thin that a lot of the time these culms are actually breaking as they're climbing up over these trees, and that the top of the culm will actually die back. And so that dead wood, as they continue to grow from a branch, that dead wood will sort of contribute to that weight that they're leaving on those trees. Finally, above ground biomass in coarse, fine, total, and intermediate biomass, we saw that Guadua chacoensis was bigger than the other two, had a lot more above ground biomass, and no significant difference between Guadua paniculata and Weber-Bowerii so far. So our preliminary conclusions here with just these three species we've seen so far is that it appears that habit rather than habitat is driving a lot of the differences between these species, especially in terms of size. With Guadua chacoensis, this very tall, erect, tree-like species differing the most significantly from the other two in most of our measured characteristics so far. However, compared to Guadua paniculata, compared to other species, Guadua paniculata, the savanna species, does follow our hypotheses for a savanna species of bamboo that is pyrogenic and not really focusing on colonization of the forest, in that it has significantly fewer rhizomes produced. It also has a narrower culm diameter at the base and is shorter in height. So it's not trying to climb up over trees, compete with them directly. It's not trying to produce a ton of rhizomes to colonize, and it's also it's not going to be as wide at the base there. We're not done. We're going to be coming back in this May through July to Bolivia. We're going to sample more Guadua Weber-Bowerii, as well as, I say, at least one species of Guadua. We're trying to hit 2 or 3 additional species of Guadua, as well as Actiniclatum verticillata. Actiniclatum verticillata is a species of savanna bamboo. It's not in the Guadueni, so it's a little bit more distantly related, but we're curious to compare the functional traits of this species to our Guadua, especially Guadua paniculata. We also still need to import our leaves for leaf sampling, so I didn't present those results yet. We're going to be working on that this summer. I'm additionally doing Angiosperms 353, phylogenetic analysis, or maybe SNPs, we'll see how it goes, to build some phylogenies of Guadua, and then we're going to place our functional trait differences on the phylogeny of the Bolivian species once we have that. To analyze our functional traits as well, we're really curious to see whether Guadua paniculata is going to cluster with this other savanna species, Actiniclatum verticillatum, or with the other Guadua. So do Guadua things, or do savanna species do savanna species things? And we're also going to look into whether there are trade-offs in functional traits related to persistence and colonization. So I have some acknowledgments, first to my sources of funding, including Iowa State and the National Science Foundation, as well as the Columbara and Arroyo families who helped with collecting, especially to the staff of the Museo de Historia Natural Noel Kempf Mercado in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. Without them, this project would not happen. This is a very collaborative effort, and they were wonderful and helpful throughout the entire project. Also to our field technicians, including Mario Aguilar Sorioco and Mario Carcase, as well as the other PhD students and postdocs who helped me collect in the field, and Bruno for helping me with coding. And thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions?
How do you standardize your cell thickness or cell walls thickness measurements?
How do I standardize?
Is it the second internode? Is it a young internode? Is it an old internode?
Yeah, so we measure, we go to the breast height, and then we go to the center of that internode that contains breast height. That was, Belen Federique came up with a standardization for that, and that's the one that we use. We're very careful not to measure culms that have any insect damage to them, so that we're able to get an accurate measurement there for that species. Yeah.
Interesting ecology. Just a few quick points. I didn't hear the carbon-nitrogen numbers. Secondly, do the herbivores find it hard to walk through thorny, leaning bamboo? And third, what do you think prevents Guadua from being the bamboo that ate the entire forest?
Gosh, good questions. Okay, so first, the carbon-nitrogen ratio numbers, you didn't hear those because we haven't actually conducted that analysis yet. Our leaves are still sitting in the museum in Bolivia. We just need to get them imported, and that will be happening this summer. So I'm really curious to see those results, as you are apparently as well. The thorns, so they could actually help to prevent herbivory. However, I have seen cattle bulldoze their way through a guapasalso, a Guadua paniculata savanna. The leaning ones. Yeah, I think it really depends on the size of the herbivore. They typically have some space above the ground, so I have seen actually a capybara go quite quickly under the leaning ones. The cattle can kind of go through anything. Unfortunately, a lot of our native herbivores in South America went extinct during the Pleistocene, so it's a little bit hard to tell what the original herbivores would have been doing there. And then your final question.
What prevents the positive feedback from taking over the entire forest?
Yeah, well, that's kind of what we're looking into here. So what we've seen is that in the savanna, or in the forest itself, fire does not spread very well, and when it does, it tends to stay fairly low. So it's not going up into those trees to kill the trees. And we've actually, in one location in Bolivia, in Chiquitinía, where I was studying, there was a guapasal, and then there was fire suppression that occurred, and then a lot of trees moved in, they got quite big, and the next time a fire actually went through there, it stayed so low to the ground that it killed back the Guadua paniculata, but it didn't really affect the trees. And so when we came back 3 years later, the Guadua appears to be dying. So we're actually seeing a conversion there of the savanna to forest habitat. And it appears to be happening very quickly, so it's sort of in line with the alternate stable states that we expected to observe.
One last question? Nobody? Okay. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Elizabeth. And